The crystal chandelier in the Blackstone family's mahogany-paneled dining room cast elegant shadows across their faces as Victoria Blackstone slid the leather portfolio toward me with the kind of satisfied smile usually reserved for delivering terminal diagnoses. "Luna, darling," she purred, her voice dripping with the condescension she had perfected over 3 decades of looking down on people she considered beneath her station. "We need to discuss some practical matters before the wedding next week." I sat in the antique chair that probably cost more than most people's cars, wearing the modest dress I had carefully chosen to maintain the illusion that I was just a simple social worker lucky enough to catch the attention of their precious son Alexander. Around me, the Blackstone family had assembled like a tribunal. Richard, Alexander's father, whose steel empire had made him one of the wealthiest men in the state. Victoria, whose old money pedigree had taught her that breeding mattered more than character. And James, Alexander's older brother, whose smirk suggested he was about to enjoy watching his family humiliate his future sister-in-law. "A prenuptial agreement," Victoria continued, opening the portfolio to reveal documents thick enough to choke a horse, "is simply a practical necessity when there's such a significant disparity in family resources. We're sure you understand that we need to protect Alexander's inheritance from any unfortunate circumstances that might arise in the future." The words hit exactly as they were intended, like a slap across the face of a woman who had dared to reach above her station. Alexander shifted uncomfortably in his chair beside me, his silence speaking volumes about where his loyalties lay, when family pressure collided with romantic love. "Of course, we don't mean to imply that you're marrying Alexander for financial security," Richard added, with the kind of false diplomacy that made the insult even more cutting. "But our lawyers insist on comprehensive protection for family assets that have been accumulated over generations." James couldn't resist twisting the knife deeper. "The prenup is pretty straightforward, Luna. In the unlikely event of divorce, you walk away with exactly what you brought to the marriage, which, according to our research, isn't very much." His laughter was joined by his parents' chuckles, the sound of people who had never doubted their superiority over someone they considered a gold-digging social climber. I looked down at the document that laid out their assumptions about my worth in brutal detail. No significant assets, no substantial income beyond my social work salary, no family wealth to contribute to the union. The prenup offered me a pittance in the event of divorce, enough to rent a modest apartment and buy a used car, as if I should be grateful for their generosity in acknowledging I was worth anything at all. "Take your time reviewing it," Victoria said with mock kindness, "though I'm sure someone with your background might want to have a lawyer explain the more complex financial provisions. We can recommend someone who works with people in your situation." Someone in my situation. The phrase was carefully crafted to remind me that I was a charity case, a lucky accident who had somehow convinced their son to propose despite my obvious inadequacy as a potential Blackstone family member. "Actually," I said quietly, pulling out my own leather portfolio from the designer handbag they assumed I couldn't afford, "I have a counterproposal." The laughter died as I opened documents that would change their lives forever. "Before we discuss what I might take from this marriage, perhaps we should discuss what I'm bringing to it." Victoria's eyebrows rose with the kind of patronizing amusement that comes from expecting entertainment value from the desperate protests of someone caught in an obvious lie. "Oh, Luna, sweetheart, there's no need to pretend you have assets to contribute. We've done our research." "Your research was inadequate," I replied, sliding my bank statements across the table. "These show liquid assets of $12,400,000, accumulated over the past 8 years through strategic investments in technology startups, cryptocurrency, and commercial real estate." The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway, each second marking the death of their assumptions about who they were dealing with. "That's impossible," Richard said, his business instincts finally overriding his shock enough to examine the documents I had provided. "These account numbers, these investment portfolios. Luna, where did this money come from?" I smiled at my future father-in-law with the kind of patient warmth I had been practicing for 2 years, while they treated me like an inferior species. "The same place your money came from, Richard. Intelligence, hard work, and the ability to recognize opportunities that other people miss." Victoria was staring at the financial statements as if they were written in a foreign language, her perfectly composured face showing the first cracks in a lifetime of certainty about her position in the world. "But you're a social worker," James stammered, his earlier smugness replaced by confusion as he tried to process information that contradicted everything his family had believed about me. "I am a social worker," I confirmed. "I'm also a millionaire who has been very careful about who knows it, until now." Alexander was looking at me like he was seeing me for the first time, which in many ways, he was. The question now, I continued, is whether you still want a prenuptial agreement, or whether you'd prefer to discuss how your family's arrogance is about to cost more than you ever imagined. From the moment Alexander brought me home to meet his family 18 months ago, the Blackstones had sized me up with the calculating precision of livestock appraisers, cataloging everything from my department store clothes to my modest car to my humble profession as evidence that their son had fallen victim to a clever social climber who saw him as her ticket to financial security. "She's very sweet," Victoria had said after our first family dinner, her tone suggesting that sweetness was a character flaw rather than a virtue, especially when displayed by women who lacked the pedigree to deserve their son's attention. "But Alexander, darling, you have to consider whether she truly understands the responsibilities that come with being part of the Blackstone family." The responsibilities, as Victoria defined them, included hosting charity galas for causes she personally endorsed, maintaining social connections with families who mattered in their circles, and producing heirs who would carry on the family name with appropriate dignity and breeding. I had apparently failed every test of suitability they had devised to evaluate my worthiness as future family member. "She works with homeless people," James had pointed out with the kind of distaste usually reserved for discussing communicable diseases, which is admirable in theory, but hardly the kind of social contribution that enhances family reputation. Our wives typically focus on more prestigious charitable activities. The prestigious activities included serving on museum boards, organizing fundraisers for private schools, and supporting arts organizations that provided tax benefits while allowing wealthy families to network with other wealthy families. My work with homeless shelters and addiction recovery programs was seen as noble but misguided, like volunteering to clean sewers when you could be arranging flowers for country club events. "Luna comes from a very different background than we're used to," Richard had observed with diplomatic understatement after learning that my parents were a retired postal worker and a school nurse, rather than industrialists or old-money aristocrats. "She may need time to adjust to our family's social expectations and financial responsibilities." The background checks they had commissioned, because of course they had investigated me like a potential security threat, revealed exactly what they expected. Middle-class origins, state university education, student loans that had been paid off through careful budgeting rather than family wealth, and no trust funds or inherited assets that would contribute to the marriage's financial foundation. "She's after his money," Victoria had confided to her sister during a phone call that I had accidentally overheard while helping with holiday preparations. "It's obvious to everyone except Alexander, who's too smitten to see how calculating she really is. Mark my words, if we don't intervene, she'll take him for everything he's worth in a divorce settlement." The intervention had taken many forms over our 18-month courtship. Victoria had introduced Alexander to several more suitable young women from appropriate families, arranging coincidental encounters at social events where these perfectly bred debutantes could demonstrate their superior qualifications as potential Blackstone wives. Madison Thornton would be perfect for Alexander, Victoria had mentioned repeatedly, describing a blonde heiress whose family owned half the commercial real estate in the city. "She understands the social obligations of marriage within prominent families. She has experience managing charitable organizations, and her trust fund would complement rather than drain family resources." James had been more direct in his disapproval, treating me with the kind of polite dismissal usually reserved for household staff who had forgotten their place. During family gatherings, he would engage in detailed conversations about business deals and investment strategies that excluded me from participation, making it clear that financial discussions were above my comprehension level. "Luna probably doesn't understand the complexities of portfolio diversification," he had said, when I attempted to contribute to a conversation about real estate investment opportunities, his condescending smile suggesting that my opinion was as welcome as financial advice from a child. The condescension had extended to every aspect of our relationship integration. When Alexander and I went house hunting, Victoria had insisted on accompanying us to provide guidance about appropriate neighborhoods and property values, steering us toward modest suburban homes that would keep me in my proper economic lane. "You don't want to overextend yourselves financially," she had advised while dismissing my interest in a downtown loft, "especially when Luna's income contribution will be so limited. It's better to buy conservatively and build equity slowly than to risk foreclosure, because you've chosen a lifestyle you can't really afford." The assumption that I couldn't afford anything substantial had become so ingrained in their family narrative that they stopped bothering to hide their discussions about my obvious gold-digging motivations. I had become the cautionary tale they used to warn other wealthy families about the dangers of allowing their children to date outside their social class. Alexander's situation just proves that successful men need to be careful about women who see them as meal tickets rather than partners, Richard had explained to his golf buddies, apparently forgetting that I was within earshot during a country club dinner. It's unfortunate, but when there's significant wealth involved, romantic feelings often get confused with financial opportunity. For 18 months, I had absorbed their condescension, played the role of the grateful girlfriend who was lucky to be accepted into their superior family, and allowed them to believe that their money made them better human beings than the woman their son had chosen to marry. Today, watching their faces as they processed my financial statements, I realized that their arrogance had blinded them to the possibility that appearances could be deceiving, and that blindness was about to cost them everything. The truth about my financial success began 8 years earlier in a cramped studio apartment where I survived on ramen noodles and determination while working as a junior social worker by day and teaching myself cryptocurrency trading by night, driven by a childhood promise I had made to my dying grandmother that her granddaughter would never be poor or powerless in a world that crushes people who can't defend themselves. Mija, Abuela Rosa had whispered from her hospital bed when I was 16, her weathered hands gripping mine with surprising strength as machines monitored her failing organs. The world will try to make you small because we are not born with money or important names. But you are smart, you are strong, and if you learn to make money work for you instead of working for money, no one can ever make you feel less than what you are worth. The lesson had been born from her own experience as an immigrant who cleaned office buildings at night to support her family, watching wealthy executives waste more money on lunch than she earned in a week, while treating her as if she were invisible furniture that happened to empty their trash cans. Rich people are not better people, she had continued, her voice growing weaker but more intense. They are just people who learned different rules about money than we were taught. Learn their rules, play their game better than they do, but never forget who you really are underneath the success. I had carried those words through high school and college, majoring in social work, because I genuinely wanted to help people while minoring in economics because I wanted to understand the systems that kept people trapped in poverty. My professors had thought the combination was eccentric. Most social workers focused on service rather than wealth accumulation, but I had been planning something bigger than a traditional career path. The cryptocurrency revolution had provided my entry point into serious wealth building. While my social work colleagues were debating the ethics of accepting donations from questionable sources, I was studying blockchain technology, analyzing market patterns, and investing every spare dollar into Bitcoin when it was still trading for hundreds, rather than thousands of dollars. You're gambling with money you can't afford to lose, my roommate Sarah had warned when she found me hunched over my laptop at 3 a.m, tracking Asian cryptocurrency markets and calculating optimal trading positions. What if this whole Bitcoin thing turns out to be a scam? What if it doesn't? I had replied, showing her the financial projections I had developed based on adoption rates and technological infrastructure improvements. What if this is the beginning of a completely new monetary system, and we're watching it happen in real time? The early investments had been terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Every dollar I put into cryptocurrency was money I couldn't spend on clothes, entertainment, or the kind of lifestyle my college friends were enjoying through credit card debt and parental support. But every successful trade was proof that Abuela Rosa had been right about learning different rules for money. By my second year out of college, my cryptocurrency portfolio was worth more than my social work salary. By my 4th year, it was worth more than I could earn in a decade of traditional employment. By my 6th year, it was generating enough passive income to fund both my modest lifestyle and aggressive reinvestment in technology startups that were reshaping entire industries. Luna, you should really consider a career change, my supervisor at the homeless shelter had suggested, when I turned down a promotion that would have doubled my official salary. You have so much potential, and social work doesn't offer the kind of financial security that someone with your intelligence deserves. But social work had provided something more valuable than financial security. It had given me credibility as someone who cared more about service than money, creating the perfect cover for wealth accumulation that no one would suspect or investigate. The tech startup investments had been the next phase of my strategy. While working with homeless clients during the day, I spent evenings researching companies that were developing solutions for problems I observed firsthand. Apps that connected people with social services, platforms that helped recovering addicts find employment, technologies that streamlined nonprofit operations. You have an unusual perspective for an angel investor, explained Marcus Chen, the founder of a startup that had created AI-powered case management software for social workers. Most investors focus on profit potential, but you understand the operational challenges our platform solves. That insight makes your money more valuable than capital from people who just see numbers on spreadsheets. The insight had translated into spectacular returns, as several of my portfolio companies were acquired by larger tech corporations for valuations that multiplied my initial investments by 10 or 20 times. Each success had generated capital for larger investments, creating a compound growth cycle that had built serious wealth while maintaining my public identity as a dedicated but financially unremarkable social worker. The real estate investments had been the final component of my wealth-building strategy. Using profits from cryptocurrency and tech investments, I had purchased rental properties in neighborhoods that were gentrifying but still affordable, focusing on buildings that generated consistent cash flow while appreciating in value as urban development transformed their locations. Your portfolio is remarkably sophisticated for someone without formal financial training, observed Patricia Wells, the private wealth manager I had finally hired when my assets exceeded $10 million. Most people with your level of wealth inherited it or built it through high-profile careers. You've essentially created generational wealth while working in public service. The irony wasn't lost on me that the Blackstone family's research had missed $12 million in assets because they had been looking for the wrong kind of rich person, someone who flaunted wealth rather than someone who had learned to accumulate it quietly while maintaining a humble public persona. Now, watching their faces as they processed my financial statements, I realized that their arrogance had made them sloppy investigators and even worse judges of character. Maintaining the illusion of modest means while secretly managing a $12 million portfolio required the acting skills of a seasoned performer, and I had spent 2 years perfecting the role of Luna, the humble social worker who was grateful for Alexander's attention despite being obviously beneath his family's standards. The performance had begun with my wardrobe, carefully curated from discount retailers and outlet stores to create the impression of someone who shopped for price rather than style. Every dress, every handbag, every pair of shoes had been chosen to suggest financial constraint without appearing cheap, the delicate balance of someone who took pride in her appearance but couldn't afford designer labels. "You always look so put together," Victoria had observed with barely concealed condescension during one of our early meetings, her tone suggesting that looking good on a budget was somehow pathetic rather than resourceful. "You must be very creative about finding affordable fashion options." The comment had been delivered as a compliment, but received as intended, a reminder that I shopped in stores the Blackstone women wouldn't enter, that my efforts to dress appropriately for their social circle were transparent attempts to appear more affluent than my circumstances allowed. My car had been another crucial prop in the performance. The reliable but unremarkable Honda Civic I drove to family events was actually my second vehicle, the daily driver I used for work while my BMW remained hidden in a private garage across town, never brought to occasions where the Blackstone family might see it and question how a social worker could afford German luxury engineering. "Luna's so practical about transportation," James had commented after seeing me arrive at a family barbecue in the Honda, his voice carrying the kind of approval adults use when praising children for making age-appropriate choices. "She understands that flashy cars are just expensive ways to get from point A to point B." The apartment I had shown Alexander during our early dating period was actually a modest rental I maintained specifically for occasions when he might visit, furnished with pieces from Target and IKEA to create the impression of someone making the best of limited resources. My actual residence, a luxury downtown loft with city views and custom furnishings, remained my private sanctuary, visited only by me and the housekeeper I paid to maintain it. "Your place is so cozy," Alexander had said during his first visit to my decoy apartment, his tone mixing genuine affection with subtle condescension as he surveyed the carefully chosen secondhand furniture and budget decorations. "You've made it really homey despite the size constraints." The financial performance had been the most challenging aspect of the deception. Every dinner check had to be approached with careful choreography, expressing gratitude when Alexander paid, while occasionally insisting on contributing my fair share from what appeared to be a carefully managed budget. The credit card I used for these occasions had a low limit and was paid from a checking account that contained only my social work salary. "Luna's so thoughtful about money," Victoria had observed, after watching me calculate tips and split checks with mathematical precision, apparently interpreting my careful budgeting as evidence of financial anxiety rather than performance art. "She clearly understands the value of a dollar." The investment conversations had required the most delicate navigation. When the Blackstone family discussed their stock portfolios, real estate holdings, and business ventures, I had played the role of an interested but naive observer, asking basic questions that suggested financial sophistication was beyond my comprehension. Cryptocurrency sounds so complicated, I had said during a dinner conversation, where Richard was explaining his conservative investment philosophy, carefully concealing my expertise in blockchain technology behind wide-eyed confusion. I can barely manage my checking account, let alone understand digital money. The statement had earned approving nods from the entire family, confirming their assumption that I was financially unsophisticated and therefore no threat to their accumulated wealth. My social media presence had been curated to support the performance, filled with photos from hiking trips and home-cooked meals rather than luxury travel or expensive restaurants. Every post was designed to portray someone who found joy in simple pleasures because more expensive entertainment was beyond her means. "Luna has such a refreshing perspective on happiness," Victoria had commented after seeing my Instagram photos of farmers market visits and beach picnics, apparently believing that my modest lifestyle choices reflected financial necessity rather than strategic positioning. She doesn't need expensive things to feel fulfilled. The charitable giving had been the trickiest element to manage, since my actual donations to various causes far exceeded what someone with my supposed income could reasonably afford. I had been forced to make anonymous contributions while publicly supporting smaller organizations with amounts that matched my cover story's financial capabilities. "It's wonderful that you volunteer so much time," Alexander had said, when I declined his invitation to a charity gala because the ticket price would seem outrageous to someone earning a social worker's salary. "Not everyone can afford to contribute money, but giving your time is just as valuable." For 2 years, I had lived a double life that required constant vigilance, careful planning, and the psychological stamina to allow people I was growing to care about to treat me as if I were beneath their consideration. Every condescending comment, every assumption about my financial limitations, every reminder of my supposed inferiority had been endured as part of a larger strategy. But now, watching the Blackstone family struggle to process the evidence of my actual wealth, I realized that their arrogance had made them willing participants in their own deception. The Blackstone family empire had been built on steel, but their attitudes had been forged from pure arrogance, the kind of institutional superiority that comes from 3 generations of wealth and the unshakable belief that financial success equals moral superiority over people who possess less money but infinitely more character. Richard Blackstone's grandfather had founded Blackstone Steel during the post-World War II industrial boom, transforming a single foundry into a regional powerhouse that supplied materials for skyscrapers, bridges, and manufacturing facilities throughout the Midwest. The company's success had created not just wealth, but a dynasty of people who believed that business acumen was hereditary and that their financial achievements reflected genetic superiority rather than historical timing and favorable economic conditions. "The Blackstone name means something in this city," Richard would declare during his frequent speeches at country club events, his voice carrying the unconscious authority of someone who had never questioned whether his success was earned or inherited. "When people see our logo on a building, they know it was built with integrity, quality, and the kind of craftsmanship that you can only get from families who understand the value of reputation." The reputation Richard cherished so deeply was built as much on exclusion as excellence. Blackstone Steel did business primarily with other old money families, country club members, and social circle connections who shared their values about maintaining appropriate class distinctions in professional relationships. "We prefer to work with people who understand our standards," Victoria would explain, when friends asked why Blackstone Steel rarely contracted with newer construction companies or minority-owned businesses, her tone suggesting that these standards were about quality control rather than social discrimination. "It's not personal, it's just that some people lack the breeding necessary to represent our family name properly." The breeding Victoria referenced so frequently was her own claim to superiority, tracing her lineage back to railroad barons and textile magnates who had built their fortunes during the Industrial Revolution. Her great-great-grandfather's portrait hung in their dining room, a stern-faced man whose accumulated wealth had apparently granted his descendants permanent superiority over people whose ancestors had been too busy working for wages to accumulate generational assets. "Victoria's bloodline adds real distinction to our family's social position," Richard would boast to business associates, as if his wife's genetic heritage was a corporate asset that enhanced Blackstone Steel's market value. "When you marry into established wealth, you gain access to networks and traditions that new money simply can't replicate." James had absorbed his parents' attitudes with the unconscious ease of someone raised to believe that his financial advantages reflected personal merit rather than accidental birth circumstances. At 32, he served as Blackstone Steel's executive vice president, a position he had earned through family connection rather than competitive hiring, though he genuinely believed his rapid advancement proved his exceptional business talents. "I've always been naturally gifted at strategic thinking," James would explain to anyone who questioned his meteoric rise through the corporate hierarchy, apparently oblivious to the reality that most employees don't have the luxury of learning from their mistakes, while protected by unconditional job security and unlimited second chances. The family's charitable activities were carefully chosen to enhance their social standing, while providing maximum networking opportunities with other wealthy donors. Victoria served on hospital boards and museum committees, where her contributions bought access to decision-making positions and prominent recognition, while avoiding organizations that serve truly needy populations without offering reciprocal social benefits. Effective philanthropy requires strategic thinking about where your contributions can have the greatest impact, Victoria would explain, when asked why the family foundation focused on arts organizations and private school scholarships, rather than homeless shelters or addiction treatment centers. "It's more beneficial to support institutions that serve the broader community rather than enabling dependency among people who should be working to improve their own situations." The enabling dependency argument was particularly rich coming from a woman who had never worked a day in her life, whose every comfort had been provided first by her father's textile fortune and then by her husband's inherited steel company, but who considered herself self-made because she had successfully married into appropriate wealth. Their attitudes toward Alexander's previous girlfriends had followed predictable patterns based entirely on family pedigree and financial status. Women from established families were welcomed warmly and evaluated as potential daughter-in-law material based on their ability to enhance Blackstone's social standing. Women from middle-class backgrounds were treated politely, but discouraged from developing serious relationships with their precious son. "Alexander has always been too generous with his affections," Victoria had confided to her sister about his dating history, her voice carrying the concern usually reserved for discussing addictive behaviors. "He sees the best in everyone, even when they're obviously using his family connections to advance their own social position." The assumption that anyone from a modest background must be using Alexander for social advancement never occurred to them as projection of their own values onto people who might actually care about character more than bank account balances. Their treatment of employees, service providers, and anyone who worked for rather than with the Blackstone family revealed the depth of their class-based assumptions about human worth. Housekeepers, landscapers, restaurant servers, and retail workers were addressed with polite but distant courtesy that emphasized their position as providers of services rather than human beings deserving of genuine respect. "You have to maintain appropriate boundaries with staff," Victoria had advised when she noticed me chatting warmly with their housekeeper about her daughter's college plans. "Friendly is fine, but too much personal interest can create confusion about professional relationships." Now, sitting across from them as they processed my financial statements, I could see their worldview crumbling in real time as they faced evidence that their assumptions about wealth, breeding, and social superiority had been completely wrong about the woman they had dismissed as beneath their consideration. The plan I had been developing since our third family dinner was as methodical as my investment strategy and twice as satisfying, designed not just to reveal my hidden wealth, but to systematically destroy every assumption the Blackstone family had made about their superiority over people they considered beneath their social station. The wedding venue selection had been my first strategic move, though the Blackstones believed they were making the decisions. When Victoria suggested the exclusive Grandview Country Club, where my membership application had been quietly approved 6 months earlier, using my real financial credentials, I had enthusiastically agreed while pretending to be overwhelmed by the luxury and expense. "Are you sure we can afford something so elegant?" I had asked with perfectly performed anxiety, watching Victoria's face light up with the satisfaction of someone generous enough to provide opportunities for the less fortunate. "I don't want Alexander's family to overspend just because I've always dreamed of a fancy wedding." What Victoria didn't know was that I had purchased a significant stake in the management company that owned Grandview Country Club, giving me voting rights in major operational decisions and access to detailed financial information about every member's account status and payment history. The catering arrangements had been equally strategic. When Richard recommended Platinum Events, the exclusive catering company that served all the best families, I had appeared grateful for the suggestion while secretly reviewing their client list, vendor contracts, and business relationships through my position as an anonymous investor in their parent company. "We want to make sure Luna has the wedding she's always dreamed of," Richard had declared magnanimously, apparently believing that providing top-tier vendors for someone who couldn't afford them independently was an act of charitable generosity rather than routine wedding planning. The guest list compilation had provided the most valuable intelligence-gathering opportunity. As Victoria and I worked through the Blackstone family's social connections, she had unknowingly given me detailed information about the financial status, business relationships, and personal vulnerabilities of everyone who mattered in their elite circle. Of course we'll invite the Hamiltons, even though their construction business has been struggling lately, Victoria had confided while reviewing potential guests, her voice carrying the concern that wealthy people feel when their friends face financial difficulties. Poor Margaret has been so embarrassed about having to downsize their country club membership. Each piece of gossip, each financial revelation, each admission about family friends' business problems had been carefully catalogued in my memory as potential leverage for the larger strategy I was developing. The bachelor and bachelorette party planning had offered perfect cover for researching the social dynamics and financial dependencies that held the Blackstone family's world together. While Victoria organized an elaborate celebration for me with women I barely knew from their social circle, I had quietly investigated the business relationships that kept Blackstone Steel profitable and the personal connections that maintained their social status. Luna's bachelorette party will be so sweet, Victoria had told her friends while planning an afternoon at the spa, followed by dinner at the city's most expensive restaurant, apparently forgetting that the guest of honor could theoretically afford neither luxury without family charity. She's getting to experience the kind of lifestyle she'll have access to as Alexander's wife. What Victoria didn't realize was that I had been discreetly documenting every conversation, every revealed business connection, every admission of financial or personal vulnerability that might become relevant when the time came to demonstrate exactly what their arrogance would cost them. The prenup ambush itself had been carefully orchestrated to provide maximum dramatic impact while ensuring legal protection for the strategy's implementation. By allowing them to present their insulting offer first, I had created the perfect setup for revealing information that would fundamentally alter every relationship dynamic in the room. The timing of this meeting is particularly interesting, I had mentioned to my attorney 3 days earlier, reviewing the final elements of my strategy, while she prepared the legal documents that would support my counterattack. They've scheduled the prenup discussion for exactly 7 days before the wedding, presumably believing that time pressure will force me to accept whatever terms they offer rather than risk calling off the ceremony. But the time pressure worked in my favor rather than theirs, since 7 days was exactly the window I needed to implement financial maneuvers that would demonstrate the true cost of underestimating someone they had dismissed as inferior. The business intelligence I had gathered through months of patient observation would now become the foundation for moves that would systematically dismantle their assumptions about power, wealth, and social superiority. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Patricia Wells, my wealth manager, had asked when I outlined the plan that would transform a humiliating prenup presentation into a demonstration of power that would reshape the Blackstone family's understanding of their position in the world. "They've spent 2 years treating me like charity case," I had replied, while reviewing the final details of my strategy. "It's time they learned that arrogance is expensive, and they're about to pay full price." The strategy was elegant in its simplicity. Use their own social connections and business relationships against them, while revealing that the woman they had dismissed as beneath their consideration was actually in position to control their financial future. The wedding preparations had become an elaborate chess game where every vendor selection, every venue decision, and every guest accommodation was simultaneously a romantic celebration and a strategic positioning move that would give me unprecedented leverage over the Blackstone family's financial and social infrastructure. The flowers alone had created 3 different power dynamics that Victoria remained blissfully unaware of, while she planned arrangements that she believed showcased her sophisticated taste and generous budget. Primrose Gardens, the exclusive florist she had selected to provide only the finest blooms for such an important family occasion, was actually owned by a company in which I held controlling interest through a complex network of investment vehicles. "Luna will have the most beautiful flowers," Victoria had gushed, while reviewing elaborate arrangements that would cost more than most people's cars, apparently enjoying the role of fairy godmother providing luxury experiences for someone who couldn't afford them independently. Every society bride in the city uses Primrose Gardens for important events. What Victoria didn't realize was that every society bride's payment information, guest preferences, and family financial details were now part of a database that I could access at will, providing unprecedented intelligence about the spending patterns, credit limits, and relationship dynamics of everyone in their social circle. The music arrangements had been equally strategic. When Richard suggested the Metropolitan Orchestra, whose private performances were considered the ultimate status symbol for families who wanted to demonstrate their cultural sophistication, I had appeared overwhelmed by their generosity, while secretly reviewing the orchestra's client contracts and performance schedules. Music sets the tone for the entire celebration, Richard had explained, while negotiating arrangements that would cost $15,000 for a 4-hour performance, apparently believing that providing such entertainment for my modest background represented extraordinary family generosity. The Metropolitan Orchestra has performed for governors, senators, and the most important families in our region. The client list Richard referenced so proudly was now in my possession, along with detailed information about payment schedules, special arrangements, and the personal preferences of every wealthy family who had hired elite entertainment for their private events. But the guest accommodations had provided the most valuable strategic opportunity. The Grandview Hotel, where out-of-town wedding guests would stay, was part of a hospitality group that I had acquired significant influence in through strategic investments made over the previous year. We've reserved the entire executive floor for Alexander's college friends and business associates, Victoria had announced while coordinating reservations that would cost the family nearly $50,000 for a weekend of luxury accommodations. It's important that our guests experience the kind of hospitality that reflects well on the Blackstone name. The executive floor reservations had given me access to guest lists, room assignments, and personal preferences of everyone important in Alexander's professional and social network, along with their credit card information, billing addresses, and special requests that revealed details about their personal lives and business relationships. The rehearsal dinner venue had been selected with similar strategic considerations. When James suggested the Platinum Club, the private dining establishment that served as an informal meeting place for the city's business elite, I had enthusiastically agreed while concealing my recent acquisition of membership through carefully structured ownership positions. The Platinum Club will give Luna a chance to experience real fine dining, James had said with the kind of educational tone usually reserved for cultural exchange programs, apparently believing that exposing me to elite cuisine was a form of social service. It's where all the important business deals in this city get discussed over dinner. The important business deals James referenced were now documented in reservation records, private room bookings, and special event arrangements that had provided me with detailed intelligence about merger negotiations, partnership discussions, and confidential business strategies that would become relevant when I needed to demonstrate exactly how much power I had quietly accumulated. The wedding photography arrangements had completed my information-gathering network. Cameron Studios, the society photographers who documented every important celebration among the city's elite families, maintained archives that included guest lists, family relationships, and social connections spanning decades of high society events. Cameron's photographs will be treasured family heirlooms, Victoria had explained while reviewing portfolio samples that documented generations of wealth, power, and social connections among families who controlled the city's economic and cultural institutions. Their client list reads like a who's who of American success stories. The client archives I had gained access to through my investment in Cameron Studios' parent company contained photographic evidence of business relationships, family connections, and social dynamics that would prove invaluable when I needed to understand exactly how the Blackstone family's world functioned and where its vulnerabilities lay. Every wedding vendor, every service provider, every entertainment option had been selected not just for quality and prestige, but for the strategic intelligence and operational control they would provide when the time came to demonstrate that their assumptions about my social status and financial capabilities had been catastrophically wrong. The trap had been set with their own preferences, baited with their own arrogance, and they had walked into it willingly while believing they were demonstrating their superiority over someone who didn't deserve their son's affection. The morning after the prenup ambush, I began implementing the financial strategy I had been developing for months, starting with a series of carefully coordinated moves that would demonstrate exactly how much control I had quietly accumulated over the Blackstone family's business interests and social infrastructure. The first strike targeted Blackstone Steel's supply chain relationships, which I had been studying through my positions in various metals trading companies and industrial supply firms. Over the past year, I had systematically acquired minority stakes in 3 of their primary raw material suppliers, giving me voting rights in decisions that could affect pricing, delivery schedules, and contract renewals. Effective immediately, all contracts with Blackstone Steel will be reviewed for compliance with our new environmental and social governance standards. I instructed my proxy representatives during emergency board meetings at Midwest Metals, Superior Alloys, and Industrial Resources Corporation, 3 companies that provided roughly 60% of the materials Blackstone Steel used in their manufacturing processes. The environmental and social governance standards I had developed were perfectly reasonable requirements that most modern companies could easily meet, unless they had been operating with the kind of old-fashioned business practices that prioritized family connections over competitive bidding, environmental responsibility, and fair labor relations. Blackstone Steel has been operating under legacy contracts that don't meet current industry standards for transparency and accountability, explained Jennifer Walsh, the corporate governance consultant I had hired to implement the new requirements. They'll need to demonstrate compliance with fair hiring practices, environmental impact assessments, and competitive bidding processes within 30 days, or their preferred vendor status will be terminated. The 30-day compliance deadline was strategically chosen to coincide with the wedding date, ensuring that Richard would face a major business crisis during what should have been his son's celebration, while also demonstrating my ability to affect their family's financial security through decision-making positions they didn't know I held. The second strike targeted the Blackstone family's country club memberships and social connections through my recently acquired influence in several hospitality and entertainment companies. Grandview Country Club, the Platinum Club, and the Metropolitan Golf Association all received new membership review notifications that would require financial disclosure statements and character references from current members. We're implementing enhanced due diligence procedures for all memberships. Patricia Morgan, the membership committee chairwoman I had recommended for election, announced during emergency meetings at all three organizations. Recent regulatory changes require increased scrutiny of members' business practices and community contributions to ensure our organizations maintain appropriate reputational standards. The enhanced due diligence procedures were designed to reveal information about the Blackstone family's business practices, political contributions, and charitable giving patterns that could be compared against their public statements about community involvement and social responsibility. But the most devastating strike targeted the financing arrangements that supported Blackstone Steel's operations and expansion plans. Through my investments in regional banking institutions, I had gained access to credit committee decisions and loan review processes that affected their access to working capital and development funding. Blackstone Steel's loan applications will require additional environmental impact assessments and labor relations documentation before approval, announced David Chen, the credit committee chairman whose election I had quietly supported through strategic contributions to his campaign for the position. Recent changes in federal lending regulations require enhanced review of companies with potential compliance issues. The additional documentation requirements were legitimate banking industry standards, but they would delay approval of credit facilities that Blackstone Steel needed to fulfill current contracts and pursue new business opportunities, creating cash flow pressures that would become apparent during their next quarterly financial review. Luna, we need to discuss some business developments that might affect wedding planning, Richard called that afternoon, his voice carrying the kind of controlled concern that businessmen use when major deals are threatening to collapse. There seem to be some regulatory issues affecting our vendor relationships and financing arrangements. What kind of regulatory issues? I asked with perfectly performed innocence, as if I had no knowledge of the compliance reviews and credit evaluations that were systematically dismantling his comfortable business relationships. Nothing serious, just some new requirements that our lawyers are reviewing, Richard replied, though his tone suggested the requirements were more problematic than he wanted to admit. It may take a few weeks to sort everything out, but it shouldn't affect any wedding arrangements. The timing was perfect, because Richard's attempt to minimize the business problems proved that he still didn't understand who he was dealing with, or how much power I had quietly accumulated over the systems that supported his family's lifestyle and social status. The financial warfare was designed not just to create immediate business pressure, but to demonstrate over the coming days that every aspect of their comfortable life, from club memberships to supplier relationships to financing arrangements, existed at the discretion of people who didn't share their assumptions about inherited superiority. Phase 2 begins tomorrow, I told Patricia Wells during our evening strategy session, reviewing the additional moves that would escalate the pressure while maintaining plausible deniability about my involvement in their business difficulties. The revelation of my true identity began at exactly noon on Thursday, 3 days before our scheduled wedding, when Alexander's entire family received simultaneous invitations to an emergency meeting at the downtown offices of Wells & Associates, the private wealth management firm that had been quietly managing my investments while maintaining their discretion about my financial status. "Luna, darling, what is this about?" Victoria called within minutes of receiving the invitation, her voice carrying the kind of strained patience that wealthy people use when dealing with bureaucratic inconveniences they don't understand. "We're far too busy with wedding preparations to attend meetings about financial planning. Surely whatever this is can wait until after the ceremony." "Actually, it can't wait," I replied calmly, reviewing the presentation materials that would transform their understanding of our family dynamics forever. This meeting will determine whether there's going to be a ceremony at all. The Wells & Associates conference room had been prepared like a courtroom, with financial documents, investigation reports, and business intelligence materials arranged to maximum dramatic effect. Patricia Wells herself would lead the presentation, lending professional credibility to revelations that would otherwise seem impossible to believe. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming," Patricia began, as the Blackstone family settled into chairs around the conference table, their expressions ranging from confusion to irritation at being summoned for what they assumed was some kind of administrative formality. "We're here today to discuss the financial arrangements surrounding Alexander and Luna's marriage, but perhaps not in the way you expected." The first slide of the presentation displayed my investment portfolio in all its $12 million glory, with detailed breakdowns of cryptocurrency holdings, technology investments, real estate assets, and business ownership positions that had been accumulating value for 8 years, while the Blackstone family treated me like a charity case. "This can't be accurate," Victoria stammered, staring at numbers that contradicted 2 years of assumptions about my financial status. "Luna works as a social worker. She drives an old Honda. She lives in a tiny apartment. These figures must belong to someone else." "The figures belong to your future daughter-in-law," Patricia confirmed with professional satisfaction, advancing to slides that showed my business ownership positions in companies throughout their industry and social circle. "Luna Morrison has been conducting due diligence on your family's business practices and social connections for the past 18 months, using her investment positions to gather intelligence that you provided willingly because you never suspected she had the financial sophistication to use it strategically." The second phase of the revelation detailed my positions in their supply chain companies, club memberships, and service providers, demonstrating that I had spent months positioning myself to control aspects of their business and social lives that they had taken for granted as permanently secure. "You own stock in our suppliers?" Richard asked, his business instincts finally grasping the implications of what he was hearing, while his parental assumptions struggled to accept that his son's humble fiancée had been playing a much more sophisticated game than anyone realized. "I own controlling or influential stakes in most of the companies that provide essential services to Blackstone Steel and maintain the Blackstone family's social status," I confirmed, advancing to slides that showed the scope of my strategic investments. "Which is why your recent compliance problems and membership reviews are not regulatory coincidences. They're business decisions being made by someone you've spent 2 years treating as if she weren't worth your respect." James was staring at the presentation materials as if they were written in a foreign language, his earlier smugness replaced by dawning recognition that his condescending attitude toward his brother's fiancée had been directed at someone with more financial power than he possessed. "This is impossible," he muttered, apparently unable to process the mathematical reality of my net worth. "You can't have this kind of money. We investigated you. We know your background." "You investigated the identity I allowed you to discover," I replied, enjoying the first moment of complete honesty I had been able to share with Alexander's family since we met. "My real background includes a cryptocurrency investment strategy that began 8 years ago. Technology startup investments that have generated returns of over 2,000%, and real estate holdings that provide monthly passive income exceeding your father's annual salary." The third phase of the revelation was the most devastating. Detailed documentation of their business practices, club membership activities, and social behavior that would be reviewed against the governance standards I was implementing through my various corporate positions. "Your compliance reviews aren't bureaucratic inconveniences," Patricia explained, while displaying evidence of discriminatory hiring practices, environmental violations, and ethical lapses that would affect their access to vendor relationships and financing arrangements. "They're accountability measures being imposed by someone who has documented your family's treatment of people you consider beneath your social status." Victoria's face had gone white as she processed the implications of being evaluated by the woman she had spent 2 years dismissing as unworthy of her son's affection. "What do you want from us?" she asked, her voice smaller than I had ever heard it. "I want you to understand that your assumptions about wealth, breeding, and social superiority were wrong," I replied. "I want you to recognize that the woman you treated as a gold digger actually has more financial resources than your entire family combined, and I want you to appreciate the irony that your arrogance convinced you to humiliate someone who had the power to humiliate you back." Alexander had remained silent throughout the presentation, staring at me as if seeing his fiancée for the first time. "Luna," he finally said, "who are you really?" 3 months after the canceled wedding that never happened, I sat in my downtown penthouse overlooking the city where I had secretly built an empire while playing the role of humble social worker, reviewing quarterly reports that showed how thoroughly my financial warfare had transformed the power dynamics that once seemed so permanently fixed in the Blackstone family's favor. Blackstone Steel had survived the compliance challenges and financing disruptions, but barely, and only after implementing operational changes that acknowledged the new realities of doing business with companies that prioritized environmental responsibility and fair employment practices over family connections and old boy networks. "We've had to restructure most of our vendor relationships," Richard had admitted during the awkward lunch meeting he had requested 6 weeks after the revelation, his voice carrying the humility of someone who had learned that pride is expensive when directed at people with hidden power. "The new compliance requirements have actually improved our operational efficiency, though the transition was more challenging than we anticipated." The transition had been challenging because it required Blackstone Steel to compete on merit rather than relationships, to justify their contracts through quality and price rather than social connections, and to acknowledge that their business success depended on people they had previously dismissed as inferior. Victoria had struggled more with the psychological adjustment than the financial implications, apparently finding it difficult to rebuild her social identity around the discovery that her assumptions about breeding and class had been catastrophically wrong about the woman she had spent 2 years treating as unworthy of family inclusion. "I keep thinking about all the things I said," she had confessed during a phone call that came 2 months after the canceled wedding, her voice carrying genuine regret rather than strategic apology. "All the assumptions I made about your background, your motivations, your character. I was wrong about everything that mattered." The admission had been more satisfying than revenge, because it represented genuine recognition rather than forced acknowledgement of superior power. Victoria's understanding of her own prejudices was more valuable than any financial damage I could have inflicted through continued business pressure. James had responded to the revelation by completely restructuring his approach to business relationships, apparently recognizing that his condescending attitude toward people he considered beneath his social station had created vulnerabilities that more sophisticated operators could exploit. "I've hired a consulting firm to review our employee relations and community engagement strategies," he had reported during a surprisingly respectful conversation about industry best practices. "It turns out that companies with diverse leadership and inclusive hiring practices actually outperform organizations that rely primarily on social connections and family networks." The recognition that diversity and inclusion were competitive advantages rather than charitable obligations represented a fundamental shift in perspective that would benefit Blackstone Steel's long-term success while acknowledging realities that the family had previously ignored. But Alexander's response had been the most complex and emotionally challenging aspect of the aftermath. Our relationship had ended, not because of anger or betrayal, but because of the recognition that our connection had been built on assumptions and deceptions that made authentic partnership impossible. "I keep wondering how much of what I fell in love with was real," he had said during our final conversation, his voice carrying sadness rather than accusation, as we both processed the reality that our relationship had been based on incomplete information. "I loved Luna, the social worker who needed protection and support. I don't know how to love Luna, the millionaire who was protecting and supporting me." The observation had been painful because it was accurate. Our relationship had been built on his desire to be the provider and my willingness to play the role of someone who needed provision, creating dynamics that couldn't survive the revelation of our actual circumstances. "The person you fell in love with was real," I had replied, though we both recognized that the context of our connection had been fundamentally altered by the truth about my financial independence. "But the relationship you thought we had was based on assumptions that were never true. The social work career that had provided cover for my wealth accumulation had become genuinely fulfilling in ways that transcended its strategic value. Using my resources to expand programs for homeless services and addiction recovery had transformed my understanding of how money could create social change rather than just personal security. Your foundation's impact has been extraordinary," explained Dr. Sarah Martinez, the nonprofit management consultant who had helped me establish the Morrison Foundation for Social Innovation, which now provided funding for evidence-based programs addressing homelessness, addiction, and economic inequality. "You've leveraged your business experience and financial resources to support systemic solutions, rather than just charitable band-aids." The foundation had become my primary focus, combining my social work expertise with my investment experience to support programs that addressed root causes of social problems, rather than just their symptoms, proving that wealth accumulated through intelligence and strategy could be more effective for social change than inherited fortunes managed through tradition and obligation. Looking out over the city from my penthouse office, I reflected on the strange journey from Abuela Rosa's hospital bed advice to the downtown power structure I now influence through strategic investments and philanthropic initiatives that prioritized evidence over emotion and results over recognition. The Blackstone family had learned that arrogance is expensive when directed at people who possess hidden power, but more importantly, they had learned that assumptions about class and breeding could blind them to the reality that intelligence, determination, and strategic thinking exist in people whose backgrounds don't match their expectations about superiority.